few weeks ago, I finished Gary Wills's take on Saint Augustine. I'd read a couple of his American history books years ago, Lincoln at Gettysburg and Inventing America, and I found them scholarly, thoughtful, and really informative. So I came to this book with the assumption that Gary Wills actually knew what he was talking about. So what about this biography of his? Right out of the gate, he starts off with some, I'm going to call it nitpicking. He tells us that the word confessions is the wrong translation for the Latin title Augustine used in his autobiography. He says the right word is testimonies. He explains his reasons for it, but I kind of wondered if it was worth it. I mean, why use a word that everybody understands when you can be a little pedantic? Plus, anybody who picks up Augustine's book knows right off the bat that this is more than a simple autobiography, but it's really a kind of theological meditation on his life. If you're talking about Augustine's life, you really have to get to sex. Everybody loves talking about Augustine's wild years, but Wills argues that the man wasn't actually a degenerate sex fiend. He claims Augustine was just using his libido as a metaphor for being restless. And I think I can buy that. When you read the Confessions themselves, Augustine's sex life seems to have been kind of, I'd say, ordinary, especially for the times he lived in. Augustine seems to me to have made a much bigger deal out of robbing a pear tree when he was 15 than he makes of his sex life. Now, Gary Wills makes a great effort to humanize this guy, and I think he's very successful at it. He puts Augustine squarely in his time and place. He describes what his daily life might have been, what it might have been like with his mother, his brother, his concubine, his son. He describes the staff of stenographers and copyists that Augustine must have had around him. And he ties Augustine's daily life into Augustine's intellectual development. Now, speaking of Augustine's intellectual development, that is really the greatest part of Wills's book, and I think of the Confessions themselves. You start off with Augustine's very early education, his love of Virgil's Aeneid, and his training to be a professional rhetorician. More significant to his this intellectual development was his longtime infatuation with Manichaeism and his ultimate disillusionment with it. Then came his study of Neoplatonism, and finally, his full conversion to Christianity. Now, following that conversion, Augustine's intellectual effort seems to a large extent to have been aimed at a bunch of really cranky heretics, guys like the Donatists and the Pelagians. And you know, back then, people didn't just argue on Twitter. They actually got pretty violent over theology. Seems a little extreme, but you got to say at least they had some skin in the game. Gary Wills distills Augustine's thought to three focus areas, so to speak: the human mind, the nature of time, and the nature of the divine Trinity. Now, as for Augustine's ruminations on these topics, I'm sorry to say that both of them, Gary Wills and Augustine, are way over my head. Look, this book isn't for everyone. Even if you aren't into Christian theology, you might still find it worthwhile getting into the head of a guy who lived in the 4th century. I'd say Gary Wills's biography is a decent, concise look at a guy who really helped shape the Western world. After finishing this, I was pretty convinced that Gary Wills had more or less soaked himself in Augustine's writings for years. I think this book is definitely one worth taking a look at. See you next week.